So yeah, we're going to cover as much of the Windows 365 versus Azure Virtual Desktop as we possibly can in this amount of time. I want to make sure we leave time for questions at the end, though. There is so much to cover in this space. There's no way we could do it all in an hour, but we're going to get through as much as we can. All right. So the big burning questions, right? The things that we need to address and what we're going to try to cover today are: why does Microsoft have multiple Cloud VDI solutions, right? It is probably the #1 most pressing concern and question that we hear all the time. The next question, and we'll get into this one a little bit too, is do I have to go all in with one or the other? And I think there's a lot of misconceptions around how we can approach Cloud VDI to best meet the needs of our users, and we don't always have to go with a one-size-fits-all model. So there's a lot to explore there as well. Deployments, how do, right? So there's some vast differences between the two technologies in terms of how are we going to actually get these things up and running? What is the user experience and how does it compare across the two? Total cost of ownership, right? This is probably my favorite place to play, just because I've seen some wild numbers. I've taken some drastic steps, and I have actually seen optimized to zero used at least once, where we've driven down the cost of ownership so much that the product was unusable. So then we wanted to talk a little bit about management as well, and kind of fitting things into the existing structures that we already have, or do we need to bolt more things on? So those are the big burning questions. Hopefully we'll get through that. Hopefully we'll be able to have some time as well for some Q&A at the end. But let's talk a little bit about positioning statements for both of these two technologies. Some of these are Microsoft official marketing material slides. So you'll actually see these if you go to the Microsoft.com website. But if we look at how these two things are positioned, how they're structured, Azure Virtual Desktop, the Cloud VDI, is positioned to run flexibly, right? You do any configuration that you want to do with it. You can run Citrix or VMware inside of Azure to host machines, to present them out to users. It's consumption-based licensing, whereas Windows 365 was actually born with the name Cloud PC, right? And that's the thought there, is it's your Cloud PC. It is your persistent, always on, always available desktop as a service. It's simple to deploy, it's quick, it's scalable, and it's intended to be just kind of your one-stop shop for getting users in and up and productive as quickly as possible. Now, this is probably one of those slides that if you're doing screenshots, you might want to grab this one too. Looking at the actual features and capabilities between them, there's a lot of overlap, right? There are actually 4 different models that we can look at, and if we want to get really nuanced, there's probably a million other different ways that we can break down these things too. But generally, in the Azure Virtual Desktop space, we're looking at personal computers that are one-to-one. The user gets a VM assigned to them in Azure or automatically deployed to them in Azure. They use that machine and that machine is theirs, right? Then we have pooled or multi-session machines where there's a single VM, but we're allowed to oversubscribe it a little bit, allow several users to use chunks of that machine for periods of time. That functionality, that methodology supports an auto-scaling technology that isn't present anywhere else in Microsoft's Cloud VDI stack. Then there's Windows 365 Enterprise, for which you need to have Azure Active Directory and Intune, and then it all just sort of takes care of itself. It's all bundled up here. And then there's the Windows 365 Business, which is the lightest touch, easiest to deploy. Basically, user acquires a license and has a machine and they just go, right? So we're going to talk about some of these differences, some of the functionality that exists between them, and some of the use cases and how we might target these things. What I will call out, though, is as you're looking through this list, when we're talking about the VM stock keeping units up here, note that if you have GPU requirements, you're going Azure Virtual Desktop, at least for those users. If you have app or MSIX app attach requirements, you're going Azure Virtual Desktop. If you need to be present on literally every Azure geography on the planet, you're also looking at Azure Virtual Desktop, right? So there's a few things that might kind of force you into one bucket or the other, but rather than worrying about those things in particular detail right now, let's talk about the positioning statements as they exist in Microsoft's official documentation, right? So I showed you the first slide that shows what each one is. Well, this is the target workloads identified in Microsoft's official marketing materials, right? Data security, bring your own PC, temporary workforces, M&A, disaster recovery, high capacity compute for design and development. Okay, that's great. So we have buckets. We understand what we're supposed to do with these things. Azure Virtual Desktop's official documentation says totally different stuff, right? Security, and regulation, elastic workforce, bring your own device, and specialized workloads like engineering and development. Well, I don't see any overlap here. I think these are completely different buckets, completely different categories, and frankly, I don't understand what the confusion is. No, the fact is that really there's a lot of confusion that's created by the positioning statements on the official documentation. And when customers are looking for official answers on which do I use in these conditions, the reality is they're being told the same thing by both technologies. Now, I think we can get a little bit better and a little bit more nuanced than this. If we take that exact same information and we tailor it to what we have actually seen organizations doing with these two technologies, what we see is that there is actually a pretty strong play for some of these things that have been traditionally identified as AVD in Windows 365, right? Remote work, mergers and acquisitions, users that are going to need to have a persistent machine for a period of time. A decent period of time, not a day, not a week. We're looking at a month or 2 or 3 or 4, right? Temporary workforces, bring your own PC is an absolutely perfect scenario for Windows 365, except if you're looking at contractors and partners. There is not actually an external use case scenario that's supported today for Windows 365 for external users. That's an Azure Virtual Desktop play. The same is going to be true for disaster recovery, right? So it's targeted as a DR play in the Windows 365 documentation. But I will tell you, honestly, a machine that I'm standing up in a DR data center to test to make sure that my workloads are going to survive and come back up appropriately, I don't think I'm going to have it long enough to justify the license or the cost of the monthly commit for Windows 365. And we'll get into the cost management and what that looks like and how it scales a little bit later on. But if you only have a machine up for 40 hours of a month, you can get really granular with the cost and the structure and how you're setting that up in Azure Virtual Desktop. Now, again, GPU-enabled users, that's not there yet in Windows 365. It's been on the backlog to be done for quite some time. We know it's coming, but it's not there yet. Remote app streaming, it doesn't exist as a capability in Windows 365, but I will show you a really cool trick as we get farther into this. And again, global geographies, right? What I will, though, identify, though, is while I might say that short-term employees are a better play in Windows 365, our call center workers, our branch workers, they actually, and I should have said as BYOD and mobile, sorry, our call centers and branch workers, they actually are really great candidates for using the pooled multi-session desktop environments that are available in Azure Virtual Desktop. We can get a user density onto those machines that'll help really drive down the cost of supporting and maintaining and deploying those machines. So let's dig into what it looks like from the user side, right? So we understand a little bit about how they're positioned. As a user, I can jump into myapps.microsoft.com, and you can see right here at the top, I have Azure Virtual Desktop pinned, and at the bottom, I have Windows 365 pinned. Now, what's neat about this is that functionally, there's really not a lot of difference. I may have pinned them both, but if I click on the Azure Virtual Desktop one, I actually get all of it. The Azure Virtual Desktop workspaces present to me all of my AVD machines, which include my hybrid Azure AD joined, my standalone not joined to an Active Directory, all of my apps that I have streaming from Azure Virtual Desktop, along with my Windows 365 Cloud PC. And these are all organized into separate workspaces. If I go to the Windows 365 link, though, inside myapps.microsoft.com, I'm given this experience where all I have access to is the Windows 365 desktop. Now, this is not necessarily to say that one is better or worse than the other. What's interesting, though, is that if I go to the Windows 365 spot, I have this nice little download button here. And if I click on that, pardon me, it takes me to the download the Microsoft Remote Desktop Apps page. And this is where I'm going to get the app that is the right one for my operating system. And these are going to be the most feature-rich versions of the right app for my operating system. We'll get into a little bit of a connectivity matrix in a minute, too. But if I pull that app down, what I'm going to see when I fire it up, and it doesn't matter which OS I'm on, whether I'm on iOS, Android, Mac OS, Windows, whatever, the experience of working in that remote desktop app is going to look a whole heck of a lot like the Azure Virtual Desktop landing page. I'm going to see all of my Azure Virtual Desktop environments along with my Windows 365. And I can actually add multiple users and all of the resources they have, along with multiple tenants worth of users too. So within one remote desktop app, if I am a member of multiple organizations with multiple accounts on those, I can actually see all of my available workspaces, all of my available applications, devices, all of that fun stuff too. And within this environment, I can also customize exactly what my experience should be on this. We've heard that Windows 365 can be scaled up to 16 monitors, which is crazy, and I would love to see it. I don't have 16 monitors, but you can see that I can choose of the 3 monitors that sit on my desk at the office, which 2 do I want this particular machine to consume, or which one, or how do I want it to work? How do I want to manage scaling when I move a machine from one monitor that has a higher resolution to another one? Right? Do I want to have that auto scale or do I want to keep it? So we can set all these things to happen across all of our different things. And that I will call out that we have a little bit more control in the Windows msrdc.exe than we do in, say, the other ones. So this is that connectivity matrix that I was talking about. This is another one that if you're curious to know what you can and can't do with different remote desktop app versions, this is the slide. So we've had the native Windows RDP, the mstsc.exe, tried and true, licensed from Citrix 20 some years ago and maintained in perpetuity. And it has a lot of the features that we would want to work with, but I'm going to strongly caution you not to use it if you don't have to, because that big red X at the bottom is a deal breaker. It is the only Microsoft client that does not support multi-factor authentication. So though it works, I would not use it for anything other than extremely limited test and dev scenarios. But the app that we're downloading from the Windows 365 page, the remote desktop MSRDC, you can see that it's fully baked for Windows. It does everything. If you go to the Microsoft Store and download the remote desktop app that's there that has the exact same name and the exact same icon, it is not the exact same tool. It's actually fairly feature limited. It can't do pens, it can't do cameras, it can't do all these other fun stuff. And we've actually touched on some of this in previous video content too, where actually we even fired up a Chrome OS device and connected to it. Had to actually use Teams on the local device because the MSRDC or the remote desktop app doesn't support redirection of some of the peripherals that were necessary to participate fully in those Teams meetings. So we have all of these great capabilities. Again, if you're screenshotting, this is one to grab. But if we don't have any of this, like if we're running on something super wild and wacky that we can't even get the app, there is always just the web client, and the web client is actually remarkably serviceable. It works just fine. Now, I told you we could do something pretty wild and wacky, right? And this is not to try to position one tool over the other, but there is nothing in the world that stops you from doing both things at the same time. This is a Windows 365 enterprise machine that has Azure Virtual Desktop apps streamed to it. And one of the neat things about the apps as they stream, if I go back a couple pages, right, we have these apps. When these are assigned to a user and the user logs into remote desktop, those apps automatically get added to the start menu of these machines. And there is nothing saying I can't pin them to the start bar or the taskbar of this machine. So now I'm in a cloud PC. Maybe I'm accessing it from my Android phone, right? But I need to be able to get to a cloud PC. Now I also need to be able to access this application. Am I going to come back out of my PC to open up the application, or am I just going to stick with what I'm already in? So I can actually simplify the delivery of the entire end-to-end experience. The user gets all the tools they need. It doesn't really matter how they come to them. It all works together. It all plays together perfectly. And it doesn't just do it for the users, it also does it for the administrators too. Because one of the challenges that we have to think through when we're enabling VDI in the cloud and not on premises is we don't have that VPN with all the traditional checks and rules and gateways that we would have had protecting our VPN access. What we need to do is we need to make sure that the right users at the right times are not just using our AVD and Windows 365, but they're able to get to it from the right devices at the right times. So maybe we are still handing out laptops, but they're really low power because we don't need a high power machine. We've got Windows 365. We want to make sure that we can govern access to the front doors of those two applications and allow our users to operate successfully and safely with nice, clean, clear guardrails. And the really cool thing is, like I said, this is one single conditional access policy that governs access to both. So, all right, so we've given the users the experience that they expect. It's pretty much identical across the board, whether it's Windows 365 or AVD. So it's not really going to come down to a UX experience. What we need to start talking about is the differences in the deployments of these two technologies. This is the actual Azure Virtual Desktop deployment architecture design slide that is in the docs.microsoft.com. There's a lot on here. If you love infrastructure, if you love scaling up, man, this guy's got a lot for you, and it's not exhaustive either. So what you're going to need at a minimum when you start building out your Azure Virtual Desktop environment, you're going to need some sort of directory, right? In the earlier days, it had to be Active Directory. Then Microsoft added on the ability to add these machines natively to an Azure AD domain services domain. Then they added the ability to add the machines directly to an Azure Active Directory. So we have all these identity models and we have all this scaling, but at a minimum, you're going to need at least one Azure subscription. You're going to need at least a network. You're going to need at least storage. You're going to need at least compute. You're then also going to want to protect these systems, right? So you're going to then be layering in Azure Backup. Then you're going to be layering Azure Defender for Cloud. Then you're going to be wanting to monitor and unify your signal reporting. So since Defender for Cloud gets you into Defender for Endpoint, you've got the EDR capabilities, but now you want to step that up to XDR capabilities. You want to add this into Sentinel. Well, now you're starting to add a whole lot more stuff, and it's getting really complex really quickly, a lot more complex than what's shown on this slide. And it's not even just what's on that slide. The actual process of simply adding an individual device to your AVD deployments has a lot of things you got to choose through. Now, again, if granular administration is your jam, you're going to love it, I swear. And I know people who just absolutely want to get in here and they want to tweak every knob, bell, button, and whistle. And that's fine, right? There is nothing knocking that. If you are the kind of person who says, yes, I know exactly what size VMs I want to deploy in here, and I know exactly what kind of storage I want to pay for, and I know exactly what sub OU I want to add these machines to, and all that stuff, right? I know my naming conventions, I know network security. I mean, I've got it all down to a T, and I want perfect control. You're going to love it. You absolutely love doing things this way. No slight against that at all. And you can also then get in and define what are the RDP properties. And actually, this is kind of turning out to be a big sticking point. And I want to make it clear, we can control every aspect of the RDP experience in both Azure Virtual Desktop through this wonderful whole subsection of the blade. We can also do it in Windows 365, although we come at it in a very different way. So we've gotten our, 150 buttons that we've already gotten to click and push and jab and go through to get to the point of having a single machine that a user can get into. Now we're adding in this Azure Defender for Cloud, right? So we got all this fun stuff. And now if we start looking at what our subscription contains, it has a lot more stuff in it than we thought we were going to get into when we first got started. Now, I did also mention that going the Azure Virtual Desktop route means that you are consuming a lot of additional Azure resources, which means that now we have to start actually worrying about what are the service limits, not just for Azure Virtual Desktop, but also what are the service limits for the components that are that support it, right? Because in order to get to Azure Virtual Desktop, we have to have virtual machines. So I'm going to skip past my next slide here, and hopefully I got it right. Oh, I must have misplaced it. Anyway, licensing Azure Virtual Desktop, and we'll come back to this in a little bit too, is a combination of the user rights assignment that comes through the licensing that they already have, plus all the Azure components that are necessary to support it. Now, by comparison, Windows 365 deployment is 5 steps, 3 of which are optional. You can make it as simple as assign license to users and create a provisioning policy. And it can really be that simple. It's hard to oversell how simple that can be. And these option steps just became optional for most people this week. This whole concept of creating an on-premises network connection, and we will cover that, just became an optional component this week. So a pretty exciting time to be doing this, right? I was giddy and waiting excitedly to see if this was going to happen. But if we join our if we look at a traditional Windows 365 deployment, it's hard to call that traditional at only 6 months old. But what we have had to do until this week was actually join our machines to Active Directory first. And I just attended a webinar last week presented by the Windows 365 team where they explained why that is. And I think I have a slide in here later on it, and I'm happy to speak to it. But we do now have the ability to natively join it to Azure AD. But if you want to have it connected to your Active Directory, you build this on-premises network connection. And this is actually pretty cool, right? So it seems like it's something that has a little bit of overwrought checking to it. But this relies on a watchdog service that continuously checks to make sure that all of these things are in a healthy state. And I grabbed this screenshot last night at about 11 o'clock, just to show that, like, yeah, it's still happening. Like, if I went back and grabbed these screenshots right now, these things would probably be within 5-10 minutes of right now. So it's constantly re-verifying. So one of the things that really makes this nice, and frankly, you don't get this in Azure Virtual Desktop, is that these checks are ongoing. And this app operates as a little bit of a guardrail and a health check in place to make sure that when you provision something and it doesn't work right, you can come here and find out why it didn't work right. You don't have to then go hunting through logs and doing root cause analysis. Generally, you can figure it out right here. Again, not a knock on AVD. It's built differently. It has different reliances. It's just a different tool. But the on-premises network connector is a great first stop triage capability. And it's also pretty cool because if you can't pass these validation tests, it won't let you deploy. So pretty neat, right? Once you get to that point, though, if whether you're going this Active Directory or native Azure AD Join, you're going to then create these provisioning policies. And these provisioning policies just got a nice big shot in the arm in the last couple of weeks as well. You can see right here that we have our native Azure AD Join that does not require an on-premises connection. We also got the ability as of last week, or maybe actually 2 weeks ago in this particular environment, to have the machines pre-localized to a ton of different languages, right? So one of the challenges that we had prior to this was that all the machines came up in English, and then users would type in their username and they would get their localization settings from something else later. Now we can actually deliver that first run experience, that initial out-of-the-box Windows experience in the native tongues of our users, wherever they may be on the planet. These provisioning policies, you're going to also decide, what is the image that's here? Are we doing Windows 10? Are we doing Windows 11? That's got the Microsoft 365 apps baked into it. And then again, just like we were able to do with Azure Virtual Desktop, we can absolutely control the remote desktop properties that exist for these users. Whereas in AVD, we did it in the server blade for the device itself or for the host pool. Here in Windows 365, it's just an Intune configuration profile. And yes, we can absolutely take this Intune configuration profile and apply it to our Intune managed machines in Azure Virtual Desktop. But we don't have that direct RDS access in Windows 365 that we did in AVD. So it's not minor nuances, right? We achieve the same result. We're just doing it in a different method. What's cool, though, is that this is my first native Azure AD Join machine. I'm so excited. Annemiek van Vleuten gets to have the very first one that was provisioned in my environment. She is accessing it through the web version of the Windows 365 landing page. Able to jump in here. You can see that she is not a directory synced user. She is not coming from Active Directory on premises. She is able to get into her Windows 365 environment and operate as if she were are a first-class citizen, which is so exciting for me, because what that really means is that when we start dealing with things like mergers and acquisitions, when we start adding in, organizations, or adding on, subsidiaries and all that kind of fun stuff, and taking their environments on into our own, we don't have to first pull them into our Active Directory to then hairpin them back out to our Azure Active Directory to then give them access to our workloads. We can just provision them in the cloud and move on. I'm so excited. I really, truly, like today, I could go and turn off my Active Directory. It's that level of exciting. All right, so I promised we would come back and talk about how we license these things. So Azure Virtual Desktop comprises two major elements in terms of how we license it. The first is going to be the user access rights through entitlements. And there is no additional cost, right? You can't buy a Azure Virtual Desktop license in the traditional sense, right? You can't just go to the marketplace and buy one. What you do is you use these qualifying licenses, and then you add these Azure infrastructure components, and then you're able to deploy Azure Virtual Desktop. Now, this per user access pricing is relatively new, and it's actually there's a trial open on it right now that I think expires next month. But this is for external users only. And again, that's one of those use case scenarios that doesn't exist in Windows 365. So if you are looking at external users, this is your play right here. Okay. So again, we have our Azure infrastructure costs, and we covered that it's going to include virtual machines, storage for our OS, for data disks, for user profiles, and networking. Well, it's also going to include security workloads. It's also going to include any management overhead. It's also going to include whatever else you may have running in your environment. So it could be a little bit more complicated than just those three lines. And when we talk about that full range of all the Azure virtual machine sizes that can be deployed into an AVD environment, there's 571 of them, and you can exhaust that list, right? You go through it, dig, have fun, right? Go forth. Microsoft conveniently though surfaces up most used by Azure users, and that's great. And there's actually a relative overlap between these sizes and what's automatically surfaced as Windows 365 VM sizes. But I would caution just a little bit that just because these are the most used doesn't necessarily mean they're the best choices for what you're trying to do. It also doesn't mean that the cost optimizations that the costs here will reflect the way that you will use them. So these are the most common used by Azure for AVD. These are the sizes that exist in Azure Virtual Desktop. There are 12 of them. You pick all of them from that list, right? And what we know about the way that people are presented with options, and actually I've read a great big study about a phenomenon called option overload. People, when they are given a list or a choice of 1 to 5 objects, can generally choose one of the 5 objects. The more objects you add to the list, the more daunting the choice becomes, to the point where if you give me 571 choices, I might not make a choice at all. So even looking at this list of a dozen choices is not necessarily reflective of the standard workloads. And conveniently, Microsoft actually, if you go on their website right now to the Windows 365 page, will bring you these 3 like curated, best in class. You're going to have your basic, your standard, and your premium user workload sizes. What's interesting too is if you go to the Azure pricing calculator and you try to price out Azure Virtual Desktop, this language roughly correlates to the sizes of the users that you will be supporting in AVD. So while you can choose the 571, if you go to the Azure pricing calculator, you're going to get light, medium, and heavy users. Okay, so let's correlate those ideas from light, heavy, and medium to basic, standard, and premium. And what we come up with is a really interesting scenario. So I took the 3 sizes of Windows 365 that have been surfaced and their monthly cost. I then went to the list of most commonly deployed Azure virtual machines and put them into the Azure pricing calculator, and I ran several different scenarios. The cost per month, which is the raw cost based on an expectation of running these 730 hours. Then I did the reserved instance at 1 year cost. I did the what would it cost to run them only 40 hours for a month. Let's say like it's just an admin console that users get in, they work with for a day of the week. It's a development station they work with for a month or for a week of the month, right? Whatever, however it is you devise it. And then I did cost per month at 220 hours, which reflects the a little bit more than 40-hour work weeks across, what your users would typically see. Now, the reason why I chose these run times and run rates, if you do a full month, you're not optimized in Azure Virtual Desktop, right? You're paying the raw consumption of that machine just being on all the time. That's going to be important in a minute. If you're doing it at reserved instances, yes, you're going to save money. I did not calculate the 3-year reserved instance, largely because a lot of business strategies don't really survive the 3 years, right? So we get into 24 months and we realize that we're locked in, we got another year. No, what we see is the cost savings at the 1 year are sufficient that they give us the flexibility to continue to adapt our business models as we need approaching the 3 years. So I didn't run that number, but then we need to layer in storage. Are we doing standard SSD or are we doing premium SSD? And this comes down to a user experience perspective, right? So if we take these numbers and we run them out, what we get is we can vastly undercut the cost of Windows 365 in Azure Virtual Desktop with a gigantic pile of asterisks, okay? And that asterisk pile, in this 1126, this machine is severely under-provisioned. Okay, this is a B-class machine. It is designed for general purpose that does not have a high compute strain. This machine is also only running for 40 hours a month, which means that I have to do some interesting optimizations, and we'll cover how to do those optimizations later. But those optimizations reduce the user experience to the absolute minimum supported set of experiences that we would ever tolerate, right? It's going to have slow disk. It's not going to have enough memory processor to do the work that we want this user to do. The user is going to have to come in and start this machine to do their work, which is going to add time to the amount to the process of them getting in to start their work. Now, if we take some of those optimizations out, if we let the machines just run, if we move into this minimum UX, minimum user experience of enabling Start on Connect, you can see we can still undercut the cost of Windows 365, but this is just compute and disk. It's nothing else. It's none of the other required services to support the network, to support security. It's nothing else. It's just compute and disk. Okay, so if we move into this reserved instances and we're still delivering on subpar, or sorry, not subpar, standard SSD, right? It's a decent disk. It's not going to be designed for high workloads. If we go reserved instances with the cheaper disk options, we start to run out of optimizing our cost, kind of even if we've got it as optimized as we can, right? At $41 a month for a machine that's on all the time, for a machine that is never rebooting, it's never losing the user's session, it's never asking them to get out and get back in. It's just there, it lives, it's persistent. For $41 a month, I would have to do that at $100 to get the same machine size at the same compute rate in Azure Virtual Desktop. I can optimize it with that reserved instance down to $51, but I still can't get to 41, and I still have to protect it. When we start getting into the bigger machines, the costs become astronomical in very much a direction that is not favoring Azure Virtual Desktop. Now, again, I'm not trying to say that Azure Virtual Desktop doesn't have its place. It absolutely does. You cannot do a GPU in Windows 365. It doesn't exist, right? We can't support external users. There are a lot of scenarios that are optimized for Windows 3 or that are optimized for Azure Virtual Desktop. And these are single session compute environments. And before anybody drags me over the coals on that, what I will call out is that these are also single session, right? So the second you go multi-session and you have a user logs off, that environment is no longer persistent. You do not have a one-to-one experience, okay? So yes, we can drive our cost optimizations in Azure Virtual Desktop down very low. Yes, we can babysit, we can tweak the dials and the nubbins and buttons all we want to deliver exactly the experience that we want, but it may not actually be the experience the users expect. So let's talk a little bit about what happens when we just run unoptimized. This was a trial scenario of just lighting up Azure Virtual Desktop in our environment. And you can see that the cost of the VMs over 1 month from September 15 to October 15, it went from basically $0 to $535. Security Center bolt-ons, which we're covering a little bit more than just this, right? You can see that those numbers grow here as well. But we have a lot of additional bolt-on things that are running in this environment. Now, I decided to be a little bit mean with this environment and do one of my optimized to zero techniques. And at the end of November, we did exactly that. We went through and we created some very, very heavy automations in this environment that would basically reduce the day-to-day operating footprint of this thing to 0. Users have to now do things like start on connect to run these things. And yes, there's a dramatic cliff, right? It's ridiculous. This environment, though, doesn't really meet the needs of my users. There's a happy ground in between that, from a demo environment, I can't pay to support, but obviously as a production environment, you can make those choices. To get into that space, though, you're going to be doing a lot of customization. And a lot of these customizations are on a per VM basis, right? We can set auto shutdown policies, but without layering in something like Azure Logic Apps, then we're going to be doing that individually per machine. We can then also create custom roles in the identity and access management per machine to do things like enable the user to start on connect. And that's what's going to allow us to really drive down this utilization, right? So instead of having the machine on for 24 hours a day, these are the tools that'll allow us to run it for 9 hours a day. But if you do that, the user's data will be gone. It'll be reset in the morning, right? So they cannot start a process at 5 o'clock in the evening and know that it'll be done at 8 o'clock in the morning if we go this route. Now, I did promise that we would come back and talk a little bit about why Azure Active Directory Join was not natively available to Windows 365 on day one. And interestingly, when we talked last month about all the crazy 20+ different ways that are available to enroll a device into Azure Virtual Desktop, it turns out none of them were supportable on the scale that was necessary for mass enrollment of thousands of devices instantaneously in Azure Virtual Desktop, in Windows 365, pardon me. So Microsoft actually had to stop, go back, and create a brand new enrollment method that exists solely for Windows 365 devices. And that's actually what took the time from August until now. But once our machines are up in Windows 365, we're administering them exactly the same way as we do anything else that's in Intune. We're doing it through configuration profiles, right? We're doing the same levels of like update rings, feature updates, quality updates, all of that stuff that we've built for our on-premises physical machines. It just transfers natively one-to-one into our Windows 365. And if we need to create, new ones, right, we've got all these different profile spaces, administrative templates, right? Everything that we've done before works just fine. And that's really cool because it allows us to take things like our policy sets that I love because you've paid attention for them 1 month to the next, and we can apply our policy sets that exist and work fine for our standard images and overlay them into our Windows 365. But if that doesn't work for us, we can actually also go in and filter things out, right? So we can build in these filters that say, hey, Windows 365, maybe Azure Virtual Desktop too, it's pre-optimized for the cloud. I don't want some of my configurations to run on these, but I don't want to break my policy sets, so we can build these filters. So the administration now is exactly what it's always been. We're just now filtering out against specific devices, and Windows 365 also has a pre-baked security baseline in Intune. Okay, so that's something that is actually fairly new that exists solely for that space. Our app deployment, we kind of skipped past the whole concept of what are we doing with our images, right? Both Windows 365 and Azure Virtual Desktop support pulling gallery images from Microsoft or having you upload your own image. I'm going to tell you where it's possible. I like to not do that at all. I like to just use the gallery images that are there, package up my apps, deploy my apps, right? At that point, I'm not in the business of maintaining images. I'm really just in the business of delivering operating environments. And what's really cool when we go that route is that we can actually set up our applications in Intune to deliver evergreen solutions. So we're not tearing open the image, repackaging up because there's a new version of Chrome and throwing it out, right? We can get the evergreen Chrome installer. When there's an update, the device gets the update. And when new users come in and they grab, brand new deployment, they're going to pull down the installer of Chrome that then installs the latest and greatest Chrome. So, what I caution folks is if you don't have to be in the business of image management, you probably don't want to be there. So when it comes to monitoring these things, right, we talked about Azure Virtual Desktop has Azure Monitor, which is built in, it's a bolt-on capability, whereas Windows 365, these devices, because they are Intune managed natively, they are going to show up in our endpoint reports. And that's going to allow us to do endpoint analytics. And that's going to then allow us to do all of our troubleshooting. But the cool thing is, I did mention that we can do all of the same level of administration. So we take our Azure Virtual Desktop machines that are in our Active Directory. We load up a GPO that says hand management over to Intune. We then can see all these machines. And now my one user, Carl Edwards, God bless him, I wish he'd worn a ring for all the effort he put in NASCAR. He can have a Windows 365 machine and an Azure Virtual Desktop machine. We can see the app install, lifecycle management. We can see how all of these things are applying to him. He gets the exact same first-class user experience no matter which environment he chooses to come in through. We make the choice based on what's going to be the right workload for him. Does he need a GPU? Is he internal user? Does he need to just be up and running like fast? Because if that's the case, Windows 365, super easy, right? Give him a license, tell him go. And actually, one of the things I didn't cover too is that the user can actually initiate their own machine resize. If the machine is not living up to the needs of their workloads in Windows 365, we can give the user the right to request an in-place resize so they can get a bigger machine and get their work done more quickly. So that's 45 minutes of the top questions, the differences between the two. I want to open it up to any questions and answers that you guys may have. Back to Christina.
Hey, so again, first, I'll apologize again for my introduction. I'm so glad I was able to be a perfect use case for the Teams noise suppression settings. That was a first for me, but thank you everyone for joining. I know that was a lot to take in. Even Superhuman Adrian over here was acknowledging before this webinar how much content that was going to be, which leads me to answer the first question in our Q&A portion. Yes, this deck will be included in my follow-up email as well as a copy of the recording. So if you're still trying to process all of that, don't necessarily know what questions you may have, if any, we are available for any future questions. But so Adrian, we do have a question. Is there, and you might have covered this a little, is there a major difference in the printing and scanning capabilities between AVD and Windows 365? I feel a universal print comment coming.
So universal print is obviously supported in both. The difference really comes down to the client that you use to connect to it. And actually, if I can figure out how to do it, well, if I can figure out how to do it, I go back to my connectivity matrix. Let me see. It's back here somewhere. I probably went too far. There it is. Print is on here. Yes. So if you are coming from the Windows remote desktop apps, you have print capabilities. If you're coming from Mac, I do not know what that stands for because I am not a Mac person, but you can also PDF print from the web client. And scanners, you asked. Same thing for scanners.
Yes.
You can scan to the Windows app.
Perfect. Okay. And then we just got a new one. So AVD multi-session. What is a reasonable target for users or VM on high-end GPUs for things like two-dimensional and three-dimensional CAD work? I can repeat that.
Yeah, so I would actually strongly recommend that you go through the list of, so Azure Virtual Desktop, if I go back, let me see, where is the list of all the VM sizes that are there? that great exhaustive list of 571 sizes actually has in it the use cases for those sizes. Here we go. And it'll break it down. So if you go into your Azure portal and you just say, create a new VM under Azure Virtual Machines, break it down. It goes on well beyond what I can show here too, but there are specific, I think they're N series or G series that are down here that are designed specifically for GPU support. I will point out though, that just bringing up AVD machines with GPUs does not actually give you the GPU support. Enabling GPU support requires a little bit of manual massage. There's a GPO that has to be deployed in the Active Directory to light up that capability for those users.
Okay, great. And then I think last question for now, unless anything comes through. In terms of disaster recovery and backup, is there an immediate use case scenario where you would suggest Windows 365 instead of AVD?
So that's actually on my feature comparison slide here, right there. So somewhere is backup, right? Azure backup services are directly supported bolt-on capabilities to Azure Virtual Desktop. Whereas in the machines in Windows 365, it's local redundant storage. Now, I will point out, because we're managing both of these environments with Intune, and we're using all of our built-in Microsoft services, our OneDrive for Business, our Azure AD Join, we're taking a vanilla device, delivering it to the user. Their identity is bringing in enterprise state roaming, so all the fun Windows settings that matter to us are getting pre-delivered, packaged up from machines that we've used before. Intune is delivering the configuration profiles that are specific to this user across whatever environment they happen to be operating in. And then OneDrive for Business is delivering not just the user's operating files and everything, but in combination with an Intune configuration profile is also redirecting the local desktop, local pictures, and local My Documents into OneDrive for Business. So when it comes to designing the environment for Windows 365, there's really actually not a whole lot to back up. And if the machine goes haywire, it usually is quicker to just hit the reprovision button than it is to troubleshoot the machine in place. Like 20 minutes to reprovision versus, sitting there digging through logs.
Awesome. Well, so that is all that I had come in through the queue. But like I said, I know that was a lot of content, and I think you had your email up on the last slide.
I did.
But yes. Thank you everyone for attending today. So like I said, you will receive a follow-up email with the recording to this webinar and the deck by tomorrow. So if you have any questions, you can email me or Adrian. So you got both of our emails up there. And in the future, please be sure to keep up with us on social and check out our events page for more upcoming webinars. And Adrian, thank you as always. You crushed it. I'm disappointed Daisy did not make an appearance though. I know you said she was going to take over today.
Yeah. The wind is scaring her, so she's in the house right now.
Okay. Well, yeah, thank you everyone. And with that, have a great rest of your Thursday, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.